right, so, in last lecture I said, well, we have these questions about moral rights, which are what we're interested in this class. You know, what exactly are moral rights? Why are they important? And, not that we're going to go a huge way to answering this last one, this is, you know, definitely a huge debate in society, but what specific rights should we have? We'll say a little bit about it, but goodness, you could have several classes on this whole question, right? In a lot of law schools, they will have whole classes on this question. So I think a good theory of what moral rights are, this is a little controversial, but I think a lot of philosophers would agree that this is a pretty good account, and I think it does a good job of explaining what we often take them to be and why they're important, is a theory put forward by this philosopher, Ronald Dworkin. And he says, his sort of way of summing this up is rights are trumps. Or, you'll often hear this, some people will say rights as trumps, right? And I think this is a pretty good theory of what rights are and why they're important. And I'll talk more about this, what this means in a second, but when Dworkin talks about this, what Dworkin means is a trump in the sense of a trump card, right? There's a lot of card playing games, where you try to take hands. I think they're called like trick-taking card games. And if you guys have ever played them, a lot of them, depending on the game, if it's with a regular pack of cards, it'll be a certain suit. If it's like special, there's special decks, like one color maybe, And what it means is if it's a trump card, you don't even look at the number, right? If diamonds are trumps and I play a 3, it doesn't matter if everybody else has played a queen, a jack, a 10, I take the hand, right? If blues trumps, we don't, if it's one of those with colors, we don't even look to see, oh, it's a 10, it's an 11, it's whatever. We just say, okay, he played a blue card, right? In the same way, rights, thinking of them as trumps, they trump or override other considerations. Except other rights, right? In a game, if I play a 3 and it's the trump, and you play a 5, you win, right? In the same way, even if rights are trumps, they can be overridden by more important rights. That's the basic idea. So let's take a step back, though. I want to do a little scene setting, and then we'll dig more into this idea. Think about how, to take the step back, let's think about how we justify laws and policies for the most part in our society. In most cases, it's enough to say that this law or policy creates the most happiness. Well, most happiness, what's that? That's our friend good old utilitarianism, right? Most laws and policies, or at least a lot of them, we can think on purely utilitarian grounds. Let me give you guys an example. I know this is a law in Norfolk because I got fussed at about it. A cop fussed at me about it. Some finger wagging going on. I think it's a law in Virginia Beach too. You can't have your dog on the beach, I think after Labor Day, right? For me, it was like one day after Labor Day. I forgot it was it was like that Tuesday, and this cop, blah, 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 blah. Finger wagging, no dogs on the beach. Anyway, right? Why don't we allow dogs on the beach after Labor Day? It gets warm. People want to do other stuff on the beach. You don't want to be laying out on your beach towel and somebody's dog run up and start sniffing you or eating your sandwich or whatever, right? Perfectly good, even though I'm complaining a little bit about the cop. Perfectly good law, right? Why don't we let dogs on the beach after Labor Day? Well, after Labor Day between 10 and sunset, right? Why do the cities have those laws saying you can't bring dogs on the beach then? Because it creates the most happiness. A lot of people would be annoyed if there were dogs running around while they're trying to enjoy the beach, right? Think of some other laws also involving dogs, right? You can't have your dog off leash at first landing, right? You can't have your dog off leash at the beach no matter what time. Why? Because again, this creates the most happiness if we make people keep their dogs under control. Just a couple more examples, right? I don't know the exact decibel levels, but cities have noise ordinances, right? You can't you can't create too much noise, and the amount of noise you can create goes down even from its normal level after 8 or 9 o'clock, right? Why? You might like to blast music at your house, but it will really annoy all your neighbors. Your unhappiness at not being able to basically take the paint off with the sound is outweighed by the fact that your neighbors are happier if things have to be kept to a certain limit, right? My unhappiness at not being able to walk my dog at 10:30 on the Tuesday after Labor Day is outweighed by all the people who don't have to put up with being annoyed by dogs running around on the beach while they're trying to enjoy the beach, do other stuff, right? If you want to justify these laws, all you need to do is to cite good utilitarian reasoning, right? It creates more happiness if we don't let people do this. Go back to my other example, keeping a goat in the city, right? I don't think that's legal in Norfolk. I don't think that's legal in Virginia Beach either. Why don't we let people do this? Because it will create the most happiness. If people have barnyard animals, they're going to get loose, they're going to annoy other people. We will say you can't do that, and all the justification you really need is that it creates the most happiness. People are really annoyed when their neighbors have goats, right? Especially in the city. Here's the thing, though. There are certain things, like, say, religion or speech. We can already recognize this on these lists of rights. Religion and speech are on both the Bill of Rights and the UN Declaration of Rights. And Dworkin will say rights override considerations of utility. So here's an example. Think of a difference. If you say, well, why can't I have a goat in the city? It's perfectly good, perfectly acceptable for me to say, well, because it will annoy your neighbors. More happiness on balance if we don't let you keep large barnyard animals in the middle of the city, right? Why can't I play my music at glass-shattering, ear-bleeding volume on a Tuesday night? Because it will really, really annoy your neighbors. More happiness will be created if we restrict how loud you can be and make it even less on weekend nights, right? But imagine, perfectly good when we talk about utility, laws against keeping goats in the city, laws that we have to keep the sound down. But imagine the city or the state or anywhere passed a law that said, well, we don't like this one specific religious group, so they can't build any of their houses of worship in the city. And imagine our justification is, people really don't like this group. If we built one, it would really annoy everybody. And I say, well, but come on, they really want to build their house of worship here. And it's like, well, you don't understand how bigoted people are around here, how much it will annoy them to have to see this house of worship for a different religion. Even if it were true, utility, overall happiness is not a good reason to restrict where people can build their houses of worship, right? People have a right to religion. That right trumps these considerations of happiness. Or think of another one, most cities have sort of, I don't know what you call them, but like you can't keep garbage in your yard, right? if you just pile up trash in your yard, or if you put a car on blocks or whatever, the city will have an ordinance, somebody will come by and give you a talking to. It's ugly. Your neighbors shouldn't have to put up with that, right? That we could justify on grounds of utility. It annoys your neighbors. It drives down their property values. They shouldn't have to look at it. More happiness created if we say you can't just pile up garbage or junk cars in your yard, right? You could not, imagine that this city wanted to put up a law that said, well, nobody can have a campaign sign for Republican candidates or Democratic candidates, right? Imagine all the neighbors are super liberal and they're like, well, I hate to see these Trump signs. The fact that it would annoy your neighbors is not a good reason that you can't have a political sign, because that is a right to political speech that you have, right? Your right to political speech, even if it really irritates your neighbors, even if it irritates them more than if you had a car on blocks in your yard, the city or the state or the federal government shouldn't be able to restrict your right to put up campaign signs in your yard, right? That's a right. It trumps these considerations of happiness in a way that these other claims don't. The only thing that can trump a right is another right. I don't have a right to put up a campaign sign in your yard because you have a property right to your yard. That is another right. In some situations, that might trump my right to free speech. But it's not just that you're unhappy. It would be that would violate your property right. Okay. So hopefully you guys get a sense what rights are. I like both the Bill of Rights and the UN Declaration on Rights because these are good, they don't really give arguments for why we have these rights, but these are good lists of very recognizable and important moral rights. Well, so why are rights important? One main idea here is that you fail to respect human dignity when you fail to respect rights. A lot of philosophers, Dworkin, who I'm kind of drawing on here, but also Rawls and Nozick, who we'll talk about later in the semester, will base rights and the importance of rights on a Kantian idea. Remember Kant's formula of humanity: people have the ability to make choices about what's important for them. An idea here is that when you fail to respect basic rights, you fail to respect this ability to make choices, right? And now one thing that's really important here, and I think this is very important to keep in mind with rights, not all choices are equally important, right? The choice of whether you have ginger ale or Pepsi with lunch, not super important, right? The choice of who to vote for, what religion to practice, if any, who to marry, those are much, much more important choices. And rights are supposed to cover these important choices, these choices about what is valuable, what's not valuable for you. Now, just a quick question, and there's some debate on this. Can utilitarianism account for rights? A lot of philosophers like Dworkin, Rawls, and Nozick will say no, and I think there's something to this, right? I think there is something to this idea that a right means even if we could create the most happiness by doing this, we shouldn't if it violates certain rights that you have. Utilitarian, all that matters is happiness. If you think that rights go above and beyond happiness, then utilitarianism can't really, I think, capture this idea of rights. And now I think this idea of rights protecting fundamental and important choices is important to help us figure out what rights are, right? One question, you might ask yourself, would interfering with a person doing this fail to respect his or her fundamental ability to choose what is and isn't good for her, right? What's important? Would it restrict your ability to decide what's important for you? What is a good life for you, right? And think about this in two different ways, right? Think about if the grocery store says no shirt, no shoes, no service, right? I have known some people very committed to not wearing a shirt, especially in the summer. It would be kind of stupid to say that that violates their rights, right? It's not fundamental to living a good life, deciding what's important for you, that you don't have to wear a shirt on somebody else's private property, right? You can put on a shirt for 20 minutes while you go get whatever in the Harris Teeter. Same with shoes, right? Contrast that with if the grocery store had some policy that said, well, nobody can wear any kind of head covering in the store, right? Then we really are violating rights, or at least there's a question of it, right? On the one hand, there's the store owner's property rights, but then you might really be violating a right because you might be interfering with people making choices about what's important for them, right? Why is that? Well, because certain religions say that certain people should cover their heads, right? Orthodox Jews, Muslims, at least some groups will say women should cover their hair. In Sikhism, men are supposed to wear turbans. If you had to violate your religion to go shopping in the Harris Teeter, that might violate your rights because that is really a question of what's important to you, what you think is a good life, right? Having to wear a shirt for 20 minutes is different than violating the tenets of your religion, right? In the one case, there's a question of rights. We have to balance off people's rights to the religion with the store's property rights, but rights are at least a question in a way they aren't when it's just, we want to make you wear a shirt or we're not going to let you come in the store, right? So hopefully that idea of what rights are makes sense to you guys. Now we'll talk more about Rawls and his original position later in the semester, but I think Rawls is pretty good. He has this idea, we'll call it a thought experiment. Thought experiment means a sort of imagined situation. Philosophers like to call it thought experiment a lot of times. I think it makes us feel like we're scientists, even though we don't have any lab equipment or fancy results, right? But it's just kind of a little story or a way of thinking about things. And Rawls says this. Imagine you had no idea who you would be in society. You don't know if you're a man or a woman. You don't know your sexual orientation. You don't know your religious commitments. You don't know your age. You don't know your race. Rawls says, if you didn't know who you would be, what basic rights would you want to guarantee, right? And Rawls will say, you start to get stuff like you see in the Declaration of, not the Declaration, the Bill of Rights and the UN Declaration of Rights, right? You would want a right to religion because if you didn't know what religion you would be, it might turn out that you're a member of an unpopular religion people want to oppress and mess with, right? You'd probably want rights against search and seizure because you might find that you turn out to be one of the kinds of people that the cops like to hassle, right? You would want protections for speech because it might be that you have a really unpopular opinion that it is really important for you to express. Probably would not want a right to service even if no shirt, no shoes. it's not going to mess up your life if you have to wear a shirt in the store in the same way it would as if you can't practice your religion or you can't express an unpopular opinion that is important to you, right? Or in the same way if the police are always breaking into your house and tossing through your stuff, right? So if you didn't know who you are, what kinds of protections would be so fundamental that you would want to guarantee them to make sure that you could have a decent life where you chose what is and isn't important to you? Speech, property, right of some kind, religion, due process, equality before the law, the kinds of things you see in the Bill of Rights and the UN Declaration of Rights, these are the kinds of protections that you would want. Now, we'll talk more about rights here, but for now the question is, I think one right we would say that everybody would want to guarantee is a sort of right to their own body, right? No one should be able to, you have a right to your body. No one should be able to come and say, force you into slavery, right? Or no one should be able to come and force you to, and I'm putting this in scare quotes, donate a kidney, right? Take your kidney or take part of your liver from you. Now, this will be important as we go forward, but for the time being, what I want to look at is this right to our own body as it applies to drug laws. Boaz is going to say this right to our own body means that we should have a right to do drugs if we want. Is that really true or not? That's going to be one of the major questions we talk about in this unit.